along the Ukrainian border. He moved blood supplies into position and built a field hospital, which tells you all you need to know about his intentions all along. He rejected every good faith effort the United States and our allies and partners made to address our mutual security concerns through dialogue to avoid needless conflict and avert human suffering. For weeks, we have been warning that this would happen. And now it's unfolding largely as we predicted. In the past week, we've seen shelling increase in the Donbass, a region in eastern Ukraine controlled by Russian-backed separatists. The Russian government has perpetrated cyber attacks against Ukraine. We saw a staged political theater in Moscow, outlandish and baseless claims that Ukraine was about to invade and launch a war against Russia, that Ukraine was prepared to use chemical weapons, that Ukraine committed a genocide. Without any evidence, we saw a flagrant violation of international law in attempting to unilaterally create two new so-called republics on sovereign Ukrainian territory. And at the very moment that the United Nations Security Council was meeting to stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty, to stave off invasion, Putin declared his war. Within moments, missile strikes began to fall on historic cities across Ukraine. Then came the air raids, followed by tanks and troops rolling in. We've been transparent with the world. We've shared declassified evidence about Russia's plans and cyber attacks and false pretexts so that there could be no confusion or cover-up about what Putin was doing. Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences. Today, I'm authorizing additional strong sanctions and new limitations on what can be exported to Russia. This is going to impose severe cost on the Russian economy, both immediately and over time. We have purposely designed these sanctions to maximize the long-term impact on Russia and to minimize the impact on the United States and our allies. I want to be clear, the United States is not doing this alone. For months, we've been building a coalition of partners representing well more than half the global economy. 27 members of the European Union, including France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and many others, to amplify the joint impact of our response. I just spoke with the G7 leaders this morning, and we're in full and total agreement. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that. We're going to stunt the ability to finance and grow the Russian military. We're going to impose and we're going to impair their ability to compete in high-tech 21st century economy. We've already seen the impact of our actions on Russia's currency and the ruble, which early today hit its weakest level ever in history. The Russia stock market plunged today. The Russian government borrowing rate spiked by over 15%. In today's actions, we've now sanctioned Russian banks that together hold around $1 trillion in assets. We've cut off Russia's largest bank, a bank that holds more than 1/3 of Russia's banking assets by itself, cut it off from the U.S. financial system. And today, we're also blocking 4 more major banks. That means every asset they have in America will be frozen. This includes VTB, the second largest bank in Russia, which has $250 billion in assets. As promised, we're also adding the names to the list of Russian elites and their family members that we're sanctioning as well. As I said on Tuesday, these are people who personally gain from the Kremlin's policies, and they should share in the pain. We will keep up this drumbeat of those designations against corrupt billionaires in the days ahead. On Tuesday, we stopped the Russian government from raising money from U.S. or European investors. Now we're going to apply the same restrictions to Russia's largest state-owned enterprises, companies with assets that exceed $1.4 trillion. Some of the most powerful impacts our actions will come over time as we squeeze Russia's access to finances and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. Between our actions and those of our allies and partners, we estimate that we'll cut off more than half of Russia's high-tech imports. It will strike a blow to their ability to continue to modernize their military. It will degrade their aerospace industry, including their space program. It will hurt their ability to build ships, reducing their ability to compete economically. And it will be a major hit to Putin's long-term strategic ambitions. And we're preparing to do more. In addition to the economic penalties we're imposing, we're also taking steps to defend our NATO allies, particularly in the East. Tomorrow, NATO will convene a summit. We'll be there to bring together the leaders of 30 allied nations and close partners to affirm our solidarity and to map out the next steps we will take to further strengthen all aspects of our NATO alliance. Although we provided over $650 million in defensive assistance to Ukraine just this last year, let me say it again. Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the good news is, NATO is more united and more determined than ever. There is no doubt that the United States and every NATO ally will meet our Article 5 commitments, which says that an attack on one is an attack on all. Over the past few weeks, I ordered thousands of additional forces to Germany and Poland as part of our commitment to NATO. On Tuesday, in response to Russia's aggressive action, including its troop presence in Belarus and the Black Sea, I've authorized the deployment of ground and air forces already stationed in Europe to NATO's eastern flank allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Our allies have also been stepping up, adding the other allies, the rest of NATO, adding their own forces and capabilities to ensure collective defense. And today, within hours of Russia's unleashing its assault, NATO came together and authorized and activated an activation of response plans. This will enable NATO's high readiness forces to deploy and when and where they're needed to protect our NATO allies on the eastern boundaries of Europe. And now I'm authorizing additional U.S. force capabilities to deploy to Germany as part of NATO's response, including some of the U.S.-based forces that the Department of Defense placed on standby weeks ago. I've also spoken with Defense Secretary Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, about preparations for additional moves should they become necessary to protect our NATO allies and support the greatest military alliance in the history of the world, NATO. As we respond, my administration is using the tools, every tool at its disposal to protect American families and businesses from rising prices at the gas pump. You know, we're taking active steps to bring down the cost, and American oil and gas companies should not exploit this moment to hike their prices to raise profits. You know, in our sanctions package, we specifically designed to allow energy payments to continue. We are closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We've been coordinating with major oil producing and consuming countries toward our common interest to secure global energy supplies. We are actively working with countries around the world to elevate collective release from the strategic petroleum reserves of major energy consuming countries. And the United States will release additional barrels of oil as conditions warrant. I know this is hard and that Americans are already hurting. I will do everything in my power to limit the pain the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. But this aggression cannot go unanswered. If it did, the consequences for America would be much worse. America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. Let me also repeat the warning I made last week. If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond. For months, we've been working closely with the private sector to harden our cyber defenses, sharpen our ability to respond to Russian cyber attacks as well. I spoke last night to President Zelensky of Ukraine, and I assured him that the United States, together with our allies and partners in Europe, will support the Ukrainian people as they defend their country. We'll provide humanitarian relief to ease their suffering. And in the early days of this conflict, Russia propaganda outlets will keep trying to hide the truth and claim success for its military operation against a made-up threat. But history has shown, time and again, how swift gains in territory eventually give way to grinding occupations, acts of mass civil disobedience, and strategic dead ends. The next few weeks and months will be hard on the people of Ukraine. Putin has unleashed a great pain on them, but the Ukrainian people have known 30 years of independence, and they have repeatedly shown that they will not tolerate anyone who tries to take their country backwards. This is a dangerous moment for all of Europe, for the freedom around the world. Putin has committed an assault on the very principles that uphold the global peace. But now, the entire world sees clearly what Putin and his Kremlin allies are really all about. This was never about a genuine security concerns on their part. It was always about naked aggression, about Putin's desire for empire by any means necessary, by bullying Russia's neighbors through coercion and corruption, by changing borders by force, and ultimately by choosing a war without a cause. Putin's actions betray his sinister vision for the future of our world, one where nations take what they want by force. But it is a vision that the United States and freedom-loving nations everywhere will oppose with every tool of our considerable power. The United States and our allies and partners will emerge from this stronger, more united, more determined, and more purposeful. And Putin's aggression against Ukraine will end up costing Russia dearly, economically and strategically. We will make sure of that. Putin will be a pariah on the international stage. Any nation that countenances Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine will be stained by association. When the history of this era is written, Putin's choice to make a totally unjustifiable war on Ukraine will have left Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. Liberty, democracy, human dignity, these are the forces far more powerful than fear and oppression. They cannot be extinguished by tyrants like Putin and his armies. They cannot be erased from people's hearts and hopes by any amount of violence and intimidation. They endure. In the contest between democracy and autocracy, between sovereignty and subjugation, make no mistake, freedom will prevail. God bless the people of a free and democratic Ukraine. May God protect our troops. Associated Press, Zeke.
So do you have any plans to speak with President Putin at this point? And what interactions have you had with the Russian government?
I heard the first part. Do I have any plans to speak with Putin at this point, and what?
What communications have you had with the Kremlin as far as military operations in Ukraine and making sure this does not spiral into a larger conflict?
Well, it's a large conflict already. The way we're going to ensure it's not going to aspire to a larger conflict is by providing all the forces needed in the Eastern European nations that are members of NATO. NATO is more united than it's ever been, and I have no plans to talk with Putin.
Mr. President.
Wall Street Journal, Tarina.
Mr. President, you didn't mention SWIFT in your sanctions that you announced. Is there a reason why the U.S. Isn't doing that? Is there a disagreement among allies regarding SWIFT and whether Russia should be allowed to be part of it?
The sanctions that we've proposed on all their banks have of equal consequence, maybe more consequence than SWIFT, number one. Number two, it is always an option, but right now that's not the position that the rest of Europe wishes to take. Cecilia Vega, ABC.
Sir, sanctions clearly have not been enough to deter Vladimir Putin to this point. What is going to stop him? How and when does this end? And do you see him trying to go beyond Ukraine? And a second question I'll just give to you now. This statement that he gave last night, the threat that he gave, the West will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. Is he threatening a nuclear strike?
I have no idea what he's threatening. I know what he has done, number one. And number two, no one expected the sanctions to prevent anything from happening. It has to show, this is going to take time, and we have to show resolve so he knows what's coming. And so the people of Russia know what he's brought on them. That's what this is all about. This is going to take time. It's not going to occur. He's going to say, oh my God, these sanctions are coming, I'm going to stand down. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together, and we will. We will, and it will impose significant costs on him.
Will he go beyond Ukraine, sir? Do you see him going?
Yes.
Thank you. Two topics, just really quick. First, markets are down and gas prices are up. I know you always stress the difference between Wall Street and Main Street, but everybody seems to be in for some economic pain. How economically painful is it going to get for people in this country? And I do have one more question.
First of all, there's no doubt that when a major nuclear power attacks and invades another country, that the world is going to respond, and markets can respond all over the world. So there's no doubt about that, number one. Number two, the notion that this is going to last for a long time is highly unlikely as long as we continue to stay resolved in imposing the sanctions we're going to impose on Russia, period. What's the next question? I'm sorry.
The next question is, did you underestimate Putin, and would you still describe him the way that you did in the summer as a worthy adversary?
At the time, he was, I made it clear, as an adversary, and I said he was worthy. I didn't underestimate him. And I've read most of everything he's written. Did you read it? I shouldn't, I'm not a wise guy. You heard the speech he made, almost an hour's worth of speech, is why he was going into Ukraine. He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about. And I think that his ambitions are completely contrary to the place where the rest of the world has arrived.
And with his ambitions, you're confident that these devastating sanctions are going to be as devastating as Russian missiles and bullets and tanks?
Yes, Russian bullets, missiles, and tanks in Ukraine. Yes, I am.
Thank you, President Biden. If sanctions cannot stop President Putin, what penalty can?
I didn't say sanctions couldn't stop him.
But you've been talking about the threat of these sanctions for several weeks now.
Yes, but the threat of the sanctions and imposing the sanctions and seeing the effect of the sanctions are two different things. They're two different things. And we're now he's going to begin to see the effect of the sanctions.
And what will that do? How will that change his mindset here, given he's attacking Ukraine?
Because it will so weaken his country that he'll have to make a very, very difficult choice as to whether to continue to move toward being a second-rate power or, in fact, respond.
You said in recent weeks that big nations cannot bluff when it comes to something like this. You recently said that the idea of personally sanctioning President Putin was on the table. Is that a step that you're prepared to take? And if not,
it's not a bluff, it's on the table.
Sanctioning President Putin?
Yes.
Why not sanction him today, sir?
Mr. President?
Why not sanction him today?
Mr. President, if I can, you detailed some severe and swift new sanctions today and said the impact it will have over time. But given the full-scale invasion, given that you're not pursuing disconnecting Russia from what's called SWIFT, the international banking system, or other sanctions at your disposal, respectfully, sir, what more are you waiting for?
Specifically, with the sanctions we've imposed exceed SWIFT. The sanctions we imposed exceed anything that's ever been done. The sanctions we imposed have generated 2/3 of the world joining us. They are profound sanctions. Let's have a conversation in another month or so to see if they're working. Yes.
Can I ask you about Zelensky? Sir, you spoke to Vladimir Zelensky yesterday, sir. You spoke to Vladimir
What's the risk that we are watching the beginning of another Cold War, and is there now a complete rupture in U.S. and Russian relations?
There is a complete rupture right now in U.S.-Russian relations if they continue on this path that they're on. And in terms of a Cold War, that depends. You have the vast majority of the rest of the world in total opposition to what he's doing, from Asia to South America to Europe to around the world. And so it's going to be a cold day for Russia. The idea, you don't see a whole lot of people coming to his defense.
And are you, if I could follow up, sir, are you urging China to help isolate Russia? Are you urging China to help isolate Russia?
I'm not prepared to comment on that at the moment. No. Yeah. No. He's had his hand up a long time.
Thank you, Mr. President. How concerned are you that Putin wants to go beyond Ukraine into other countries, and the U.S. will have to get involved if he moves into NATO countries?
Well, if he did move into NATO countries, he will be involved. We will be involved. The only thing that I'm convinced of is if we don't stop now, he'll be emboldened. If we don't move against him now with these significant sanctions, he will be emboldened. And look, you know, well, anyway.
And can you talk anything more about your conversation? Mr. President.
Why not sanction Putin directly today?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sir, India, which is a major defense partner of the United States, is India fully with you on the issue of Ukraine and Russia?
Does the Defense Department of the United States?
So India is one of your major defense partners. Is India fully in sync with the United States on Russia?
We're in consultation with India today. We haven't resolved that completely.
One more question.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you.
And there you have it, the President of the United States making remarks about tough new economic sanctions, but holding back on what would be the SWIFT sanctions, essentially international banking sanctions that are considered the mother lode of sanctions, or personally sanctioning Vladimir Putin himself. Let's check in with Charlie D'Agata, who is in Ukraine's capital of Kyiv. And Charlie, despite these tough new punitive measures by the President of the United States, is it your understanding that Russia could capture Kyiv by the end of the day?
Well, not necessarily by the end of the day, but what I can tell you is that Russian paratroopers, this is confirmed now, have reached the outskirts of the capital. They've reached an airstrip called Gostomel. Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian military, it actually comes from President Zelensky himself, said that they have that airstrip surrounded and there is no escape. Throughout the day, we've heard several explosions. There is an intense salvo around noon here. There have been jets flying overhead all day long. It's quieted down this afternoon, but in not just that area, this is on the outskirts of the capital itself. Russian paratroopers have landed. There's a major battle underway, the way the Ukrainian ministry is describing it, and they've also reached parts of the west. So Russian forces are advancing, and again, we saw these airstrikes overnight and cruise missiles targeting places right here in the capital. We're just bracing for what may come this evening. Nora?
Charlie D'Agata there with that ominous warning as already Russian forces have captured Chernobyl, the site of the worst nuclear disaster in world history. And then President Biden saying today that he believes Vladimir Putin's ambitions are much larger than Ukraine. Some of you will now rejoin CBS programming. Our team coverage of the war in Ukraine will continue on CBS streaming. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell in Washington. There's much more to talk about as the President of the United States has just addressed and leveled these tough news sanctions against Russia and its President Vladimir Putin and those surrounding him, the country of Russia. Let's bring in our Face the Nation moderator and chief foreign affairs correspondent, Margaret Brennan. You heard the question, why not the sledgehammer approach today?
Exactly. Well, the president is really indicating that there's a divide among allies. He said that is not the option the Europeans wanted to take when it comes to cutting off Russia from the SWIFT banking system, like the world did back in 2012 with Iran, really making it a pariah. The president arguing what he is doing with Russian banks is significant, and arguably it could bankrupt some of these businesses in Russia. It could have an impact on the Russian people. But does it have an impact on Vladimir Putin's calculus? That's the big question. If you really want a nuclear option, you hit the thing Russia exports. They are the #3 oil producer in the world. They are the #2 gas producer in the world. Why can't he do that? Because we consume that product. The rest of the world does as well, and we already have inflation at a 40-year high. I mean, I've been reading economic reports this morning and talking about what the harsh impact would be, primarily in the global economy. It's targeted right at Europe. And so when the United States is trying to move in tandem with European allies, it also becomes what's politically possible for them. So he can't pull the trigger on oil. He can't pull the trigger on SWIFT because Europe isn't there yet. But certainly these are significant steps. This is financial warfare. At the bottom line here is no one is sending troops. No one is sending anything to stop this assault. Vladimir Putin has recognized that there is no line that he can't cross. No one has stopped him to date. And that's why it is so ominous. I know that both of us reacted when you heard the president say he's trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union, because the question is, where does this spiral?
Mm-hmm. And that really was, and while that we've known that, and certainly the State Department has taken actions to clear Americans out of Moldova and other places, to hear the President of the United States say that and to wonder what's next as we're witnessing a shattered Europe in many ways.
It is, and it's a shattered Europe. It's a shattered sort of faith in the institutions that have created those rules of the road. It was after World War II that NATO and the IMF and the UN and all those institutions that we take for granted that have just kind of created these guardrails for how countries interact with each other. Now they're being tested. Vladimir Putin has been picking off some of those NATO members in terms of putting pressure on them and also helping intimidate basically from embracing Ukraine fully. They are on the outside of NATO looking in, and if they were in a different position, perhaps they'd be able to defend themselves a bit more strongly. It wasn't until 2017, 2018 that the United States started giving lethal aid to Ukraine. They really couldn't stand up to Russia in 2014 when this invasion first began.
Mm-hmm. And Margaret, just as you're speaking, a statement from a senior defense official that at the direction of the President of the United States, the Secretary of Defense has ordered the deployment to Europe of approximately 7,000 additional service members. The President alluding to that of course we would continue to protect our NATO allies there and of course strengthen the flank there. These will be deployed to Germany to reassure NATO allies, from a defense official to CBS News. Let's bring in former National Security Advisor and retired General H.R. McMaster. General McMaster, good to see you. You, of course, have 4 decades of experience in foreign policy. When you listened to the president earlier today, just moments ago, was there anything you thought in his comments that might deter Putin's ambitions?
Well, absolutely, Nora, deterrence has failed already. And deterrence, I think you can think of as a simple equation of capability times will. We didn't have the capabilities in the region to deny Russia the ability to blockade Ukraine and to conduct really a 4-pronged assault on the country. And I think the assumption was that we didn't have the will. We didn't have the will to act against Putin in a decisive manner. So now we're into deterrence by punitive action later. And I think Margaret summarized some of the shortcomings in the sanctions associated with not sanctioning the oil and gas sector. That's 59% of his exports. But, you know, if you want to look on the bright side a little bit, Nora, what Putin wants really more than anything to be able to continue to advance his objective of restoring Russia to national greatness and reestablishing Russian influence across all of the territory of the former Soviet Union. He wanted most disunity. And I think what he got is a lot of unity so far. And I think you have to credit the diplomatic effort of the Biden administration and our allies in delivering that unity to him. I think he may not have expected it. I don't think he also expected us to release the intelligence that we released in previous weeks. And I think that rocked him back and may have delayed this a little bit. And even the diplomatic efforts, you know, the shuttling into Moscow of President Macron and Olaf Scholz, that was designed to say, hey, you have no pretense for war, right? We're ready to talk to you about your legitimate security concerns, but this is really not about legitimate security concerns. This is about extinguishing democracy in Ukraine. And extinguishing democracy in part because that's one of the greatest threats to his own regime is the example of a successful democratic country on his borders.
The president made clear that there will be no U.S. troops sent into Ukraine. But what about covert U.S. assistance? There has been some criticism that the Biden administration has not deployed those assets.
Well, there are a whole range of assets available to the president in that connection from certain government agencies and from our military. We have been training the Ukrainians for a long time now. We've been helping them integrate some of their new defensive capabilities. As Margaret mentioned, beginning in 2017, we began to actually finally to provide defensive capabilities, additional defensive capabilities to the Ukrainians. I'll tell you, Nora, I think this is not an easy military operation for the Russians. You know, as you get further out in these offensives, they're really difficult to sustain logistically. It's tough to keep what we call combined arms all together with the combinations of fires and maneuver and air and ground capabilities. And the Ukrainians, as you can see, are stepping up. They're stepping up to this really tremendous challenge. And of course, you know, no one has done more to reinforce Ukrainian nationalism than Vladimir Putin. So I'd like to think that this is going to be a short-term crisis, but I'll tell you, Nora, this crisis is going to go on for a long time. I think more costs will be imposed on Putin by the Ukrainians militarily, and of course, by the free world financially and economically. This could be the end of Putin, but of course, he's a very dangerous person. And who knows if this is kind of the overextension and the beginning of the death throes of his 22-year-long rule in Russia. I think there's more danger ahead.
I want to ask you about that, though, because in speaking with a number of national security officials in Washington over this past several weeks, they tried to make the case, look, Putin is not prepared for a bunch of body bags coming home of dead Russian soldiers. It will be unpopular at home. But Ukraine is not Afghanistan. And it looks like, based on what we're learning, is that he is going to move quickly to seize Kyiv. As Charlie Daggett has said, the paratroopers on the ground there. And that is, even as some national security officials acknowledged to me, then the rest of the country will fall pretty quickly. The goal of Putin is to decapitate the leadership there and to take over and install a puppet government. Why could it not just play out there with only relatively minor casualties on the part of the Russians?
Because it's not that easy, Nora, because you would have to consolidate those gains and get to a sustainable political outcome. Remember the last time he tried to put a puppet government in Ukraine, not the last time, but the time that elicited the most concerted response was the spark for the Orange Revolution in 2004, when he poisoned a presidential candidate and tried to put a puppet government into place, and that elicited a huge uprising by the Ukrainian people. Of course, it's a vast territory. It's important to look at the map of Ukraine, but hey, you got to look at the scale on the map as well. And while Kyiv is relatively close to what was the front line until the invasion, there are vast parts of Ukraine where resistance could easily continue. So this is not going to be over easily for him. And I think this is the beginning of really significant overextension by Putin, based on, but not only the limitations of his military, his conventional military, which has a kind of an elite portion of it in these battalion tactical groups. But once you get deep into that military, there are issues of discipline and readiness and combat effectiveness. And I think you're going to start seeing some of that friction and some of that difficulty. You know, Putin may have believed his own propaganda. You know, maybe he thought this would be easy, but Nora, it's not going to be easy.
And General, just to underline that point that you made about scale, Ukraine in terms of square miles is about the size of Texas, has a larger population, 44 million people. It is a large country, as you point out there. Stand by, General. I want to bring in Charlie D'Agata, who is on the ground in Kyiv, was with us last night when the fighter jets flew overseas and the explosions began. And Charlie, now you are reporting that it looks like the capital is encircled by some of Russia's forces. Tell us what you've learned.
Yes, well, this is coming to us from the Ukrainian military sources that say that a number of Russian paratroopers have landed to the north of the city at a military airfield called Gostomel. President Zelensky addressed that tonight. He said that they are surrounded and they would be defeated. He was actually much more visceral than that in terms of the fighting that's going on. But we do have to face the facts that when it comes to superior air power, the Russians have the upper hand. They've come in with helicopter gunships out on the outskirts of another airstrip just west of the city here. So they've already been able to encroach and move south from Belarus, as we understand it, to not necessarily encircle the city, but to start getting jabs into the city, to insert themselves here. Now, I don't want to paint the picture that, you know, people are fighting street by street. We have heard a number of explosions today. Most of them were happening after that first salvo that you and I discussed early this morning here anyway. Around noon, 1 o'clock, a series of explosions, not just here, but in Kharkiv. So these are all being orchestrated, sort of shock and awe, not of the scale of this morning, but it was the loudest thing that we've heard. And throughout the day, there have been a number of fighter jets, low-flying fighter jets, just going over the river behind us. And then some of that was followed by explosions. Tonight, off in the distance, we've been hearing some activity. We've been hearing a lot of air tonight, but in terms of it going kinetic, big booms that we've been seeing earlier this morning, that hasn't happened yet. Now, there is a curfew in place here. You know, martial law has been declared. So from 10 o'clock until 6 o'clock, people are off the streets. We went out today. Streets are empty anyway. The Russian military says that they've hit more than 70 targets of the Ukrainian military. We saw a little bit of damage, minor damage, that some of those strikes are clearly missing their target and falling in parts of the city here. So the local population are very worried. You know, I've been saying that just a couple of days ago, when you spoke to the people here in Kyiv, they thought the capital would be spared, the fighting would be contained to the east. As soon as that got underway this morning, it triggered a huge traffic jam, this massive exodus of people who are leaving the city. It's not a ghost town. People have been told to stay at home. Some people are taking shelter in the underground and subway stations because it's the safest place to be. Everybody's just worried of what's to come. So there hasn't been this massive onslaught. By no means have Russian forces encircled the city, but they are certainly making headway, and this is on day one of the invasion.
Charlie D'Agata pointing out those long lines and many people trying to flee the capital city. Also, just so that everyone knows, it is 7 hours ahead in Ukraine, so it is about 9:20 p.m. there. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes. And Nancy, extraordinary to hear the President of the United States talking about this being a dangerous moment for all of Europe and announcing those new sanctions. But the question is, why is he holding back on some of the toughest sanctions?
Nora, he's holding back because the White House has made the determination that unity among Western allies is more important at this particular moment than unleashing every single arrow in their quiver. As long as they can make the claim that the entire West is aligned against Vladimir Putin, they believe that that sends a very powerful message to the rest of the world. They believe it continues to isolate him, and they argue that the sanctions that they are unveiling are going to be pretty powerful in and of themselves. The president announced that now virtually every major bank in Russia is going to be cut off from Western investment. All of their assets in the U.S. will be frozen. He announced more sanctions on Russian individuals. And just a moment ago, Nora, we learned from the Treasury Department for the first time that 24 individuals and entities in Belarus are going to be sanctioned as well. And this, of course, is because Belarus has been standing side by side with Russia in this invasion, allowing Russian troops to move through Belarusian territory into Ukraine. And that sends a message as well, Nora, to any country that might be considering standing with Russia in this conflict. And there aren't many, but the message is, if you help Russia, you will get punished too.
And Nancy, there was one other thing that had been telegraphed earlier that the president mentioned, which, of course, that these targeted sectors in Russia, specifically the technology sector, he said that they will cut off half of Russia's high-tech imports, which will degrade their aerospace program. Explain the significance why they think that will bite.
Because there is technology that Russia needs that it does not produce, particularly for its military and for its aerospace industry, which is very important to Russia. If the U.S. and the U.K. and the EU all stop sending that technology to Russia, not only does it degrade Russia's ability to wage war, but it also cripples Russia's aerospace industry. And so that's something that's very important to Vladimir Putin, and something that President Biden said in his speech is critical. Yes, these sanctions may not devastate Russia's economy tomorrow, but what they do is send a message to Russian oligarchs, to Putin's inner circle, and to everyday Russians that you are going to start feeling the pain, and it's going to get worse and worse. And what the White House and its European allies are hoping is that you start to see an uprising from within, from the Russian legislature, from everyday Russians, from all of President Putin's friends and allies who say, this has gotten worse than we expected. We can't endure this financial pain. You need to change course.
Nancy Cordes at the White House, the president also saying that he will try to make sure that Americans don't feel a lot of the economic pain, because he's concerned about the pain at the pump, those increased prices we see as we fill up our gas tanks. You'll see we've just put up here what's happening on Wall Street, because the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones fell Thursday as Russia attacked Ukraine. We are now in correction territory for the year. But, Margaret, let's talk about that, because the president and European allies seem to be betting that at some point those sanctions, that what's happening to the ruble falling to its lower level, that will in some way be the type of deterrence that hasn't worked thus far.
I thought that was so interesting when President Biden said no one expected sanctions to prevent anything. Actually, that's exactly what his foreign policy team said again and again. It is what his Secretary of State said to me on Sunday alone. The purpose is to do everything we can to deter it, to prevent a war, to deter the aggression. And once you trigger sanctions, you lose the deterrent effect. Vladimir Putin was not deterred. What I heard and how the president laid it out today was that they are now looking for a reassessment by Putin, that he's gone this far. If they hit him now, will he stop where he is? But as the president of Ukraine has stood on the world stage and said, that doesn't help us when we're already hit by bombs. Sanctions are punitive. They are punishment. They haven't prevented. That is always the criticism of them as a foreign policy tool.
All of this assumes that you're dealing with a rational actor.
Yes. Also very key.
Yes, and I think that one of the things, and I'm sure your conversations and mine, and also what has been telegraphed publicly, there have been increasing comments about Putin's isolation. We saw the long table, right, that he met with Macron and others, you know, that then there's talk that they're not sure who he's relying on in terms of his advisors. What are you hearing about Putin, not only his ambitions, but also whether he can be someone that they can rationally assume will feel the pain if they exert all of these financial sanctions?
Well, that is the thing that has sort of befuddled so many of the intelligence analysts and those watching here, because they keep coming back to the bottom line. No one knows what's next except Vladimir Putin. His circle is so tight. That already was the case. COVID happened. It became even tighter. There wasn't a lot of interaction with those on the outside, and there's not a lot of insight into him other than, you know, sort of the highest levels of U.S. intelligence trying to tap in, and the world really, and all the intelligence agencies. What we know from what was happening on the ground with the military is all these intercepts were happening, and there was always this question: is is what the military doing actually what Vladimir Putin wants? Is this a game of chess? And that's why for so long you had European leaders saying, well, we don't know if we trust the intelligence because we think ultimately Vladimir Putin is a rational actor and we'll see this is going to cost him so much. He doesn't want the body bags coming back home. He doesn't want his buddies, the oligarchs, getting hit. Well, guess what? It looks like that worst case scenario the United States sketched out that so many European leaders, including the Ukrainian president, didn't seem to believe. He's going through with it right now. The question is how much farther? And that's what's so interesting here. I mean, we're going to see a flurry of diplomacy in the next hours and days. The EU is meeting to talk about their version of sanctions. You will have more NATO meetings. But a lot of this is movement. I'm not hearing a lot of momentum. No one's talking to Russia at this point.
The nightmare scenario, this full-scale, multi-pronged attack that even the president seeming to acknowledge today that Vladimir Putin's ambitions may extend beyond Ukraine. And what's next? Will there be a spillover effect? And while U.S. forces are not deployed to Ukraine and will not be, they are amongst our NATO allies. And will there be a mistake?
Exactly.
Will there be some sort of event that happens that propels U.S. and NATO ally forces to get involved? And that, of course, is what has many people on their toes today. Margaret Brennan, thank you to Nancy Cordes and General McMaster and Charlie D'Agata in Ukraine. Thanks to all of our reporters, producers, and crew around the world. Our coverage of the war in Ukraine will continue here on CBS News Streaming. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington.
Watching CBS News Streaming, I'm Tanya Rivero in New York with Omar Villafranca in Dallas. Let's bring in